Good evening. My few minutes of these remarks are the last of this memorable 2 days and a half conference. So I think my main task is to ensure a smooth transition from the conference room to the bedroom, trying not to put you asleep here, but not to wake you up too much. I will try to speak briefly in the spirit of a sort of testimony, not so much about the crisis, which has been the theme of these 2 days and a half, but more about the idea of creating something like INET, an idea that I fully share, fully support, and I will try to explain why in my remarks. Since a testimony is always a mix of subjective and objective elements, I will start with some subjective elements and speak about theorists and practitioners in economics, and then take the two components of the title of the conference, simply adding question marks, and first ask what economic crisis, and then ask what crisis of economics. So on theorists and practitioners, this is a distinction that is very often made, and we have to be aware, of course, that economics is perhaps the only science that has both theorists and practitioners. We would not say the same for other sciences. And this distinction has been widely used in interpreting or asking what went wrong in this crisis. I belong to the camp of practitioners. When I was a student, I felt that economics is ultimately about action, and I thought that the attraction of action, at least in my case, would have been irresistible at some point, so I decided to go into action. Being a believer in the celibacy of priests, I was convinced not to have the strength to make vows of chastity as they are, in my view, required to be in the laboratory for a lifetime. So I quit the laboratory after graduation and joined the laboratory of policy institution, first as a researcher in a policy institution, and then I quit that laboratory too and became a fully fledged practitioner. I have tried to be a practitioner who thinks and who writes, but I have seen what are the big differences between being a theorist and being a practitioner. You should be aware that both think, not only theorists think, also practitioners have a brain and they use it. And they think about economic problems. But the constraints are very different. For practitioners, it is not possible to choose which problem to address, and it is indispensable to think under a precise time constraint. You cannot take extra time to solve your problem. For theorists, it is possible to choose the problem, and very often the problem is chosen in such a way that it lends itself to be solved in a way that satisfies a methodological constraint that does not exist for the practitioner. The constituencies are different. For a practitioner, the constituency is the market, it may be the voters, it may be a government if the practitioner is an official. For the theorist, in a way, the constituency is made by the community of peers. So there are differences. I have been particularly fortunate as a practitioner because I have had a very intense interaction with theorists. And in the meantime, I have experimented that when a practitioner writes, the theorists, those who are in the lab, are particularly indulgent. They discount the fact that being he or she a practitioner, he cannot be rigorous, he can afford to formulate ideas and hypotheses in a way that would not be accepted by any serious review, but they somehow pay attention nevertheless, because for some reason the practitioner may have a sort of aura to those who have decided to be priests and to practice celibacy. So much for the subjective part. Now, what economic crisis? Question mark. Probably without economic crisis, INET, which if I know George a little bit, was perhaps in his mind well before the crisis, still perhaps INET would not have found the momentum to come into being. So we have to start from the crisis, and I give you in a very short way what is my interpretation of the crisis. First, the crisis is in fact the interaction of three dynamics, in my view. The first is the coming of the day of reckoning of an unsustainable growth model located primarily in the United States, based on consumption and debt. Second, it was the bursting of an asset bubble, of a typical asset bubble. Third, it was the explosion of a financial panic. And it is the coexistence of these three dynamics and their interaction which made this crisis so special. But none of the components of this crisis that I have just mentioned was unknown before. What was extraordinary were the factors that have allowed the unsustainable course to be maintained for so long as to make the correction so dramatic. I have said in other occasions that, in my view, this is not a crisis in the system, it is the crisis of a system. It is not a crisis in the system. In a way, every market economy has continuous crisis, has continuous bubble. It's just like boiling water. It's in the physiology of a market economy to have bubbles which burst continuously, but it is a pathology to have huge ones which burst after so long. So it is not, in my view, a crisis in the system. But when I say that it is the crisis of a system, we have to, and unless we all agree with those who were invading this place while Dominique Strauss-Kahn was speaking, it is not the final crisis of the capitalist system, it's not the final crisis of the market economies, it's not for the market economies was 1989 was for the centrally planned economies. So we have to ask, of which system is this the crisis? My answer to this question is that it is a crisis. It is the crisis of a particular version of the market economy, which is affected by three fundamental flaws or fundamental defects and weaknesses. The first is the ideology of market fundamentalism. The second is economic nationalism. The third is short-termism. I think I don't need to explain, these words speak for themselves. When I speak of economic nationalism, however, I intend the growing gap between the perimeter of markets and the perimeter of policies. There is one global market, there are 200 sovereign countries in the world today. Almost none of them recognizes any right to the other 199 or to the international community to limit its sovereignty. Now, these three weaknesses belong to three different areas. The first is a weakness or a flaw in the field of ideas, market fundamentalism. It's a wrong idea. The second belongs to the field of institutions. The market has become global, policy institutions have not. And the third, short-termism, belongs to the field of psychological attitudes and pervades, in my view, all the areas of economic activity. Is extremely strong in politics. It conditions the consumer behavior and the decision of households. It makes the legitimacy of government depend on weekly polls that virtually impede any policy that has the time horizon necessary to deliver the necessary results. This is my reading of the crisis, and it leads me to the other question: what crisis in economics? If this reading is correct, my answer to this question is that the crisis is not so much in the laboratory. In the laboratory of economists, almost all the ingredients and the ideas that were necessary to avoid the crisis were present. In my view, the crisis in economics, and this I think may be relevant for INET, is much more in the way the laboratory interacts with the outside. The way it interacts with practitioners, the way it interacts with teaching of economics, the way it interacts with other disciplines, the way it interacts with power structures. In all these lists, you can, and I will not because time is short, describe a number of inadequacies, flaws, insufficiencies in the interaction. And as always, if an interaction is defective, the two parties in interactions have a certain responsibility in those defects. For instance, in the interaction between practitioners and theorists, the commonality of language has been lost. The language whereby theorists speak is incomprehensible to practitioners, even if they had been 10, 20 years before excellent graduate students. They simply didn't have the time to keep with the technicalities that are indispensable in the laboratory. I read many years ago a beautiful article in the Economic Journal describing the Cambridge didactic style, the Cambridge of the years of the early part of the last century. And they were explaining that this style consisted in making a completely rigorous demonstration and analytical treatment of the issue, but then, so the articles say, throw the mathematics away and formulate the result in plain language. Today we have heard from Professor Mirles a remarkable sentence: mathematics can mislead us exactly in the same way as ordinary language can mislead us. But the two components of the economic family, practitioners and theorists, do not understand each other. And it's remarkable not only what you can expect, that a practitioner does not understand the theorist, but that the theorist often does not understand the practitioner. I remember a friend who switched from mathematics to economics, who was already doing good work and have good published stuff, and one day he asked me, but what is demand? There was no physical perception of what demand is, which is not an irrelevant concept in economics. I had an interesting experience. I've published a book with MIT Press on the European Central Bank, and I described the process of policy making in the ECB, how the analysis is done, what is the framework for policy. And then in the manuscript there was a sentence saying how the decision-making body in the ECB moved from this analysis to the policy decision. And there was a sentence, which is still there, saying analysis is an act of knowledge, decision is an act of will. The editor was strongly advised by 2 or 3 of the referees to take out this sentence. Said, no, that's not true. If the analysis is good, the analysis will tell you what the decision should be. So what do you mean by saying an act of will? So I had to struggle, and in the end to threaten to change the publisher if they didn't want that sentence in. But it is absolutely true. I said, look, we all know that there are people who have a fantastic ability to analyze things but are incapable to take decisions. So it's a continuous experience. This is one little example, but not an irrelevant one, of how distant may be the two members of the same family of economists, the theorists and the practitioners. One aspect of this faulty interaction is that very often theorists tend to be extremely rigorous and even innovative in their own field, but extremely conformist in accepting common places in matters that are not in their own field. For instance, the question of the power structure, of the institutions, of the sovereignty matters. For that, they are a passive, very often passive receivers of common places that, from a policy-making point of view, are precisely those common places that action may try to change and to alter. I have experienced that in the making of the euro. The idea that sovereignty could shift was simply not part of the world. They were told by, mainstream political scientists that sovereignty is a given, and it was a given for them. So involuntarily, very often, the theorist may be an innovator in its own field and may be part of the defense of the status quo in other fields that are extremely connected to the very same matters in which he works as a scientist. Well, I stop here because I have spoken for too long already, but just to suggest that, in my view, INET could not only promote better thinking in economics, but also contribute to change the relationships between the laboratory and these various components that are outside the laboratory. Thank you very much.